Hello and welcome to another exciting lecture for human sexuality. In this lecture, we are going to convert into short-term mating strategies. This will be part 2 of short-term mating strategies. Let's talk about one of my favorite topics now. One of my favorite topics within evolutionary theory, within all of this that we've been talking about, is what's referred to as life history theory. So life history theory essentially examines how early life environmental and social factors can affect later life outcomes in an individual. These early life factors sometimes cause epigenetic changes, but they definitely do cause biological changes. So we're looking at how early life factors, let's look at some of those early life factors, such as stress on a child, stress during infancy, stress even during when the maternal stress during pregnancy. Things like attachments and even things like change in father figure are early life factors. We'll come back to that one. Availability of resources. So you can understand how this, like someone who isn't getting enough nutrition might have effects on like their height. But what about when people grow up in a household where they really don't have much and it actually affects their behaviors as well later in life? Social economic status is related to that, and indicators of mortality. So if there's indicators of mortality in the environment, stuff like people dying or people basically attachment figures disappearing, stuff like that might be indicators of mortality, and these can cause later life outcomes. And I said some things are pretty obvious, like changing when or how tall someone gets. But how about some of these other ones, like age at reaching puberty, age at first sexual encounter, age at first offspring, average age these are, aggressive tendencies, risk-taking, mate-guarding behaviors. These are all things that are affected by these early life factors. And when I say early life factors, I don't mean like just things that are happening as someone's in their late childhood, early teenage years. I mean stuff that happens in the first few months to first few years of life. Let's look at this one right here. This one that's very interesting and has been studied extensively now. That is change in father figure. And this is primarily for females, this effect has not been found in males. If a female has a change in father figure in the first 2 years of life, so we've got the first 2 years. If a girl has a change in father figure in the first 2 years of life, this doesn't matter if it's going from a biological to a non-biological parent, a non-biological to a biological, non-biological to another non-biological, all that matters is there is a change in father figure. If there is a change in father figure in the first 2 years of life, what does that affect? Well, that affects the average age that a girl reaches puberty. A change in father figure in the first 2 years of life, the girls who have a change in father figure in the first 2 years of life tend to reach puberty earlier by up to 2 years on average earlier. They start having sex younger. They start having kids younger. They are less likely to go to college. They are more likely to use drugs and alcohol. They are more likely to be arrested for crimes. So all of those come back to this change in father figure in the first 2 years of life. And this has been extensively studied. It doesn't mean that everybody who has a change in father figure in the first 2 years of life is going to have these changes. It just means on average, that's the case. How about for boys? Well, for boys, SES and indicators of mortality lead to increased aggressive tendencies, increased risk-taking, and increased methods of mate guarding. And these haven't been studied as extensively, but they have definitely been studied. So what we're looking at here is basically things that occur in the first few years of life. How does that then relate back to talking about short-term mating strategies? Well, life history theory has two factors to it. First off, before we even get to those two factors, life history theory used to mean between species. And when it was, and it's still measured in biology between species, but you've got species that have a fast life history, and you've got species that have a slow life history. Ones that have a fast life history mature quicker. They have more offspring. And they have a shorter lifespan. Slow life history is the opposite of that. Mature slower. They have less offspring. And they have a longer lifespan. I can write today. Yes, I can. So I'm going to erase that because it's just... So the big difference between fast and slow life history when you're talking about species is basically how vulnerable they are to predation. Species that are more vulnerable to predation, species that are more likely to then die young because they're being eaten by other animals, they tend to have a faster life history. Species that have little risk of predation or less, they're less likely to become prey, so they are more likely to live longer as a result, have a slower life history. And when we're talking about between species, it makes sense. We look at things like a rabbit. A rabbit, they're very vulnerable to predation. They mature very quickly. Within 3 weeks of birth, they're on their own. They have way more offspring, but they have a very short lifespan. Even the ones that don't get hit by predators have a short lifespan because there's no selection pressures on a longer lifespan because most of them are dying before they can even reach their full life. On the other hand, species like elephants have a slower life history. They mature slower because they're not vulnerable to predation that much. So they mature very slowly. It takes 13 to 15 years for them to reach adulthood. They have less offspring throughout their lifespan because they can dedicate more resources to the individual offspring. And they have a longer lifespan as well because there's now selection pressures on later life rather than no selection pressures on later life. So this is between species. But now let's talk about within species. So when we're talking about in humans, they've recently adopted this to a within species. And what you get is these things here, like stress, increased stress, change in father figure, low resources, low SES, high indicators of mortality. All of these together lead to a fast life history because for these individuals, they are more likely to die young. They are less likely to reach old age, so to say. They are more likely to have offspring that die. So they are going to mature quicker. That's where you get this age at puberty, age at first sexual encounter, age at first offspring. They mature quicker. They tend to have more offspring, but they tend to have a shorter lifespan on average, and this has been shown too with all of those things. Conversely, those who have less stress, stronger attachments early in life, more availability of resources, less indicators of mortality, those have the slow life history. They mature slower. They reach puberty later. They tend to have less offspring. They tend to have a longer lifespan. And this has all been studied extensively, and it is true, it is the case. Which one is better? People seem to have this notion that a slow life history is better. No, a slow life history is not necessarily better than a fast life history. All this refers to is these are different adaptations to the environment. Those with a faster life history are adapting to a harsher environment. Those with the slower life history are adapting to a less harsh environment. So let's look relating to that, things like father absence. So men and women who grew up in families without fathers, so now we're not talking about change in, grew up in families without fathers, they're more likely to pursue short-term strategies, have their first intercourse earlier. And poor parental attachment also predicts these outcomes. So when we go back to what we were talking about on the previous slide with life history theory, people with a faster life history theory who adhere to a faster life history because of the way that they're basically early environments, they are more likely to engage in short-term mating because of that. And women who grew up in fatherless families tend to reach puberty earlier. This is also the case. We just talked about change in father figure does it, but fatherless families does it as well. Present stepfather, but this has been since, this is older research, the presence of a stepfather part. It's been actually found that it's not necessarily the presence of a stepfather, it's change in father figure. So I talked before about t-shirt studies and how that related to preferences, especially long-term preferences. Well, let's look at it when we talk about the difference between long-term and short-term preferences when we're talking about MHC, major histocompatibility complex. It basically causes differences in body odor. And by choosing a partner with a different smell, a woman can be helping her offspring acquire a greater immune system because the MHC is an indicator of their immune profile. So someone with a different smell, someone with a smell and MHC that is different, can lead to offspring with a broader immune profile. When ovulating women were asked what t-shirts they found pleasant, so if you recall from me explaining this before, people wear t-shirts without deodorant or soap for a few days. They then put these t-shirts in a bag, and then people smell the t-shirts that are in this bag. They can't see the person. They've never seen the person. And then they rate that based on pleasantness. They rate various different things. How sexy do you think this person is? Stuff like that. So when ovulating women were asked what t-shirts they found pleasant or sexy, they indicated those of men whose smell and MHC was most different than their own. When menstruating, they actually preferred men who were similar to their own. So in this context, they're kind of referring, especially a lot of our evolutionary history was in small group contexts. When women are menstruating, they prefer to be around men who are more like possibly their brothers for protection, for not for reproductive means, for protection, for family unit. But when they're ovulating, they prefer men whose smells are different, as in those who are not their siblings. And the interesting thing is, right here, this effect is not present. This change is not present for those who are on hormonal birth control. They always prefer men who are similar. And this is actually one of those things out there that's been found to actually cause conflict in relationships. What has been found in studies is that when people get into a long-term relationship, if the woman is on birth control when they get in the relationship, and then she goes off birth control years later, trying to get pregnant now, going off birth control, that conflict starts to arise. And some of this conflict could be because of trying to get pregnant. But some of the conflict actually comes from the fact that without even realizing it, she is not as attracted to her partner anymore because she was only more attracted to him when she was on birth control. So her preferences have now changed, and this can cause conflict. The opposite is also true. People who get into a long-term relationship when the woman is not on birth control, and then she goes on birth control and she feels less attached to the partner because her preferences have changed. They've shifted. So this is just one thing to be aware of. It doesn't mean the relationship is going to end. It just means this is one thing to be aware of, that preferences can change when you're on birth control and not on birth control. Let's look at some other things. So transitions across the life. what happens to mate value assessment after divorce, what happens to it at puberty, those types of things, they actually change strategies people have. After a divorce, people start to have different strategies. At puberty, people have different strategies. So the operational sex ratio is one thing. If there's a surplus of women, men will then have opposite effects. So right now, men are more interested in I shouldn't say right now, when there's an operational sex ratio that's even, there's even men to women, men are more interested in short-term mating. Doesn't mean they're not interested in long-term, but there's a slight preference for short-term mating. If there is a surplus of women, though, men will then have the opposite effect. They'll still do short-term mating, but now men are doing the choosing, so they will look for long-term relationships with high mate value individuals. Self-perceived mate value is important too. High mate value men pursue more short-term strategies. There's no clear effect for women though. We talked about this before with high mate value men. On the other hand, self-esteem. Low self-esteem women pursue more short-term strategies, and there's no clear effect on men for self-esteem. So self-perceived mate value, high mate value in men will lead to high self-perceived mate value in men will lead to more short-term strategies. Low self-esteem in women will lead to more short-term mating strategies. And the belief behind this, and there's no conclusive, but the belief behind this for the short term for low self-esteem women is that women who are low self-esteem have this subconscious belief that they can't find a long-term partner, so they seek out short-term strategies as a result. There's more to it than that, but that is one of the reasons there. I already explained why high mate value men do it, because they have more short-term mating opportunities, so they will pursue more short-term mating strategies. So high mate value men are more likely to commit infidelity. So let's look at paternity again. We've talked about paternity a few times, but for paternity affects short-term versus long-term mating. We talked about this already with being able to identify it. There is definitely an advantage for men to invest in biological offspring. There is a great advantage to it. When men invest in offspring, those offspring are more likely to survive and reproduce themselves. They're less likely to have many complications and issues. However, the other side of it is there's a disadvantage in investing in some other man's biological offspring. As I talked about before, the term for this is cuckoldry. So there is a disadvantage to being cuckolded, to investing in another man's offspring. We're not talking about disadvantage morally here. We're talking about disadvantage evolutionarily here. So men should have ways to assess paternity beyond just being around, but that's one of them. One of them is partner sexual fidelity during the period in which they conceived. So for this, men will do things like mate guard more when a woman's ovulating, be less likely to leave when a woman's ovulating. That increases assurances of paternity. As we talked about before, that's not always possible though, and it's not even healthy to do that. Another way to do it is through perceptions of child's resemblance. And we talked about this before, about how mothers and mothers' families comments after childbirth, but let's look at that a little bit more, as well as reports of resemblance. So as I said, we already talked about this some in long term, but let's look at it here again. Comments, so there was a study that was done by Daly and Wilson, other big evolutionary researchers, that reviewed videotapes of post-birth scenes and documented utterances about who the baby was said to resemble. 80% of the time, the remarks were made about the baby's resemblance to the father. Only 20% was to the mother. They also sent out surveys about who the new baby seemed to resemble and found that the mothers and mothers' relatives said the baby was most similar to the father, not the mother. And this has been found in many cultures. In Mexico, especially if the parents have been together for a shorter time, it actually increased the likelihood of the mother's family saying that the baby resembled the father. But it's been found in multiple different cultures now. There's even a biological effect here. So genetic relatedness to offspring. When researchers used fMRI brain scan, they discovered that men show greater cortical activity than do women when shown images of children's faces that resemble their own. So what they did for this study, it's kind of weird. They took pictures of the parents, the mothers and the fathers. But these are people who hadn't had kids themselves. They took pictures of men and women, the participants. Then they used Photoshop to morph those images onto babies. So they basically took some of the main features of the face, the nose shape, stuff like that, and morphed it onto a baby, and it looked like babies. It didn't look like babies with morphed features. It looked like, excuse me, actual babies. And the brain scans were when looking at these pictures, and they looked at images that had more of their features and images that had less of their features, and they had more cortical activity, the males did, when there were more features in common, whereas in women that wasn't as much of an effect. Really interesting stuff there. When judges were asked to match babies' photos to photos of mom and dad, they're better at matching them to moms, though. So this is saying that babies are more likely to resemble moms than they are dads, but there's still that thing going on where people are more likely to say the baby resembles the father than the mother. Also consistent with the manipulation hypothesis is that mothers mainly report on resemblance to the fathers, not to themselves, and most of the comments on father's resemblance occurs when the father is in the room. So I just said where mothers and the mother's family are more likely to say it resembles the father. They don't say that as often when the father is not in the room. They say it when the father is in the room more. Comments about the mother resembling the baby don't matter. It doesn't matter if the mother's in the room or not. So let's look at that a little bit more with that morphology and things like that. But before that, I want to go on a quick tangent. It's completely aside from this, completely unrelated to the class, but I want to talk about this guy right here. Stephen Plattek, he is a PhD. I believe he teaches at University of Florida. He is a neuroscience, a cognitive neuroscience. He's an evolutionary theorist. He's pretty interesting guy. Why is he pretty interesting? Because he is a pro weightlifter. If you've ever heard of the National Pro Grid League, it was a team weightlifting competition where it was based on speed. It ran from 2014 to 2016. It was on ESPN. You can still find it on YouTube. And basically, just completely interesting aside, this researcher who has a PhD was basically the team captain for the Miami team. So it's a bit interesting that you get people even like this that are researching the things we talk about who do extreme stuff like extreme weightlifting. All right, that's just completely aside. It's kind of an interesting thing there. If I go back later, I'll go back and I'll throw up a picture in the bottom of this slide with him when he was at his prime of weightlifting. So in 2002, he asked men how much they would invest in different children after viewing each child's face. Again, these children aren't their actual children. It is when it is morphed faces. The men had previously had their picture taken, and the experimenter morphed some of the children's faces to slightly resemble them. And the men indicated in general, on average, that they would invest more in the children who look more like themselves without even realizing it. They had no conscious knowledge of the self-resemblance, yet they said they would invest more in those children. Men in a domestic violence treatment program were asked to evaluate how much each of their children in the household resembled them, and men reported they had better relationships and were less likely to abuse those children who looked like them. Men who lived with children that looked more like them also had inflicted fewer serious injuries on their spouses. But did the kids really look like them? That's the question we have to ask, and we'll actually get to that on the next slide, looking at, well, what about if we have external judges rate this rather than the self-report? Okay, so let's look at that then. The question: do kids actually really look like their fathers? So what they did in this study is they had external judges rate how much 79 French children resembled their mothers and fathers. They also asked mothers and fathers to rate how much they resembled their own children. And they found that mothers and fathers' independent ascriptions of resemblance, basically, does the child look like the mother or the father, match those of external judges, especially regarding father's resemblance. In particular, if the judges thought the child resembled the father or the mother, both actual parents said it looked like the father. If the judges thought it didn't look like the father, both parents said it looked like the mother. And another key result is that fathers but not mothers perceive resemblance to the child correlated with their emotional closeness to him or her. So this goes back to reasoning for that when it comes down to. So all of this goes to resemblance, and more recent research has shown that on average children look more like the fathers than they do the mothers, slightly. There was earlier research that said it looked more like the mothers, but now the research is starting to indicate that children do look more like fathers. But regardless of that, there's this definite preference for men being able to identify if the kids look like them, and the mother's families and mother trying to convince the father that he looks like the kid so that there's more assurance of paternity there. So when it comes to actual genetic relatedness, Anderson showed that American men were 5.5 times more likely to support their genetic children's college education compared to stepchildren. So when they know that the child is not theirs, they're much less likely to support them. Even when stepchildren did receive money, they tended to get less. Men were asked if they were sure that they were fathers of their putative children, of their actual children that they thought that were theirs, and if fathers were unsure, the children received less support. But even when controlling for genetic relatedness, men invested more in children with their current partner than those of former partners. What does this suggest? So going back through this, men are more likely to, if you have to choose between their biological offspring, and stepchildren, they dedicate more to their biological. If there's a question, if the child is their biological, they will donate less. But even if we're talking about stepchildren here versus biological children, when controlling for genetic relatedness, men invest more in children of their current mate compared to those of former mates. Why? What does this suggest? Why is this the case? Well, you might be saying, well, they're going to dedicate more. But this goes back to one of the things we talked about earlier in the first part. Much of parental effort by fathers may be mating effort. So investing in the kids, even stepkids, makes for more mating opportunities with their partner because their partner will be happier with them. And cross-cultural data shows similar patterns across cultures. Let's look at when we talk about things like infanticide and abuse. Because the opposite of parental investment is child abuse. And much evidence suggests that stepchildren are at far higher risk. So on the left here, we've got children of 2 natural parents. On the right, we've got with 1 step parent. And this is per 1,000. So it's still pretty low in both cases. But the ones, when you're talking about a step parent, they're actually 40 times more likely to be physically abused. And even when social economic status and all of those different variables are controlled for, this effect remains. Which shows that stepchildren are at a very obvious risk. And prior to the work of evolutionary researchers in the late 80s, this wasn't something that criminologists, sociologists, all the people who dealt with child abuse, this wasn't something that was on their radar. This wasn't something they considered up until the evolutionists, Daly and Wilson, really did research on this and showed this. I will also point out that there is a big spike here earlier on. I'll talk about it in the next slide too. But what is going on with that big spike? Why is it that? I'll let you think about that and we'll talk about it on the next slide. Because on this slide, we're going to talk about homicides. So, infanticide. The risks to stepchildren are even greater for infanticide to occur, for homicides of children. So it's essentially negligible with biological parents, with 2 biological parents. It is much, much higher when you're talking about a step parent committing the act. And Daly and Wilson note that step parents do rarely commit child murder or abuse. It is still pretty low. This is 600 per million. So it is still really low. But the fact is that there's a pattern here, that the chances of it occurring are much, much higher when you're talking about a step parent. But again, let's go back to this really big spike for infants and toddlers. Why is this the case? Why might you think this to be the case? This is the case, and we actually find this in many non-human species as well, because committing infanticide, and when it's not punished, allows the female in the relationship to then have more children. Throughout human evolutionary history, women it was really unlikely that they would get pregnant again while they were still breastfeeding. There's a mechanism that works, and unless you've got proper nutrition, a woman is unlikely to get pregnant while she's breastfeeding. It can happen, but it's unlikely. So throughout most of human evolutionary history, a woman that had a child that was 3 or less, who is still breastfeeding, was less likely, very low likelihood of getting pregnant. So by committing this infanticide, killing off that offspring there, she'll stop breastfeeding and she becomes able to get pregnant again. And like I said, we see this in a lot of non-human animals. Lions, when a new lion takes over the pride, they'll kill all the cubs so that the females can then get pregnant again and have new cubs that are the new fathers. So this is something, again, it's rare still for it to happen, but the fact is there is an explanation there for it happening. Let's examine some conflict between the sexes, because whenever it comes to, and when we're talking about conflict between the sexes, we're talking about when there are competing evolutionary pressures between men and women on outcomes. We talked about earlier we talked about how there's competing pressures between mothers and offspring and how you get the birth canal to a certain size, stuff like that. Well, now let's look at it between the sexes. So we're going to look at antagonistic coevolution, perceptual biases of sexual intent, and error management theory, another really interesting theory out there. Then in a few weeks, we will cover theories of human rape and why that occurs. It is a topic that we are going to cover in here, but before we get to that topic, I will throw up a big disclaimer about it, things like that. But we'll talk about that in a few weeks. We'll also look at jealousy and how that occurs and why that occurs. We'll look at mate retention tactics and its contextual effects. And we'll look at violence towards partners, and we'll also cover that in a few weeks. Another touchy topic, but a topic that we need to cover in here. All right, let's define sexual conflict. Sexual conflict is a conflict between the evolutionary interest of individuals of two sexes. The key point, it's not between males as a group and females as a group. It's from an evolutionary perspective, you don't get group selection like this. Or if you do, it is the exception, not the norm. So it's really talking about from individual perspectives. When you talk about groups, it's really men are in competition with other men and women are in competition with other women. This sexual conflict is not necessarily competition, it's conflict in evolutionary interests. As I was saying on the last slide, men have one interest evolutionarily, and pressures they evolve behaviors and adaptations based on those. Women have another interest, and they evolve adaptations based on that. We talked about concealed ovulation before and how that's a factor, and that's one of those where there's a conflict between the sexes. For women, there's an advantage to have concealed ovulation. For men, there's an advantage to detect ovulation. So there is a conflict that arises. On this slide is some of the factors that elicit upset in relationships. And a lot of these are these things where you're going to get conflict. Jealous, rejecting, abusive, unfaithful, self-absorbed, moody, sexual withholding, sexualizes others, those types of things. And we'll look at some of these more later, but the point is that this is where you find a lot of the conflict. So the first thing we're going to look at is what's referred to as strategic interference theory. And on the previous slide was all of these various different things that occur that cause issues with relationships. And Buss calls these strategic interference. Basically, he's defining this as when one person blocks or prevents the successful enactment of another person's strategy to obtain a goal or fulfill a desire. So strategic inference theory is the fact that such conflicts of interest are widespread and have great evolutionary importance. They'll produce adaptations and counter-adaptations. Some of the ones, like I was saying, like that they're sexual withholding. Well, this is a strategy that one sex does, and there's adaptations and counter-adaptations because that strategy is keeping the other sex from obtaining their goals. In most conflict, in most things like aggression, arise, and we're not just talking about conflict and aggression in relationships, we're talking about conflict and aggression in general, arise due to being held back from obtaining your goals. So when we talk about this, we're going to look at the fact that these are specific ones that are held back from obtaining evolutionary goals. So you get things like antagonistic coevolution, where things like we'll look at first, men have adaptations. Their adaptation is penis size, penis shape, ejaculate size, ejaculate composition, such as what's referred to as kamikaze sperm, or mood-inducing chemicals. It is a known fact, it is studied, that sperm has an antidepressant effect on women. Sperm can affect the mood of women. So men have these adaptations, and these are constantly changing. They're constantly adapting. So men have these adaptations. These result in a decline in female fitness. How do they result in the decline in female fitness? That is because there's these different competitions between. If a male is evolving ways to make sure that his sperm are the one that fertilize the egg, but it's in the best interest of the female for her to possibly engage in infidelity and resulting in another male being the one that she gets pregnant with, then these adaptations here result in a potential decline in female fitness. Again, we're not talking about morals here. We're talking about evolutionary fitness. So that decline in fitness results in female adaptations, prolonged receptivity. So they're not just a female evolves adaptation to not just be fertile for one day, but fertile for multiple days. Hidden estrus, so hidden ovulation. Well, these result in the decline in male fitness, so they adapt to that and have more adaptations. And it's a constant cycle of coevolution, just like the Red Queen race we were talking about a couple weeks ago, where there's this constant coevolution going where men and women are evolving and developing adaptations to increase their fitness, which results in decreasing the opposite sex's fitness. Let's actually transition now into another thing relating to that, and that is perceptual bias of sexual intent. So this is one of those things that I think really is groundbreaking in how it changes the way a lot of things are viewed. Even statistics now is viewed with this. There's certain things in statistics that are viewed with this in mind. But Hazelton and Buss, so Marty Hazelton, she is now at UC Berkeley, I believe, but she is really big in the field of evolutionary psychology. But when she was one of Buss's grad students, she asked men and women to imagine a date and then rated the degree of sexual interest communicated on 15 dating behaviors. So, such as asking women, if I engaged in this behavior, I would want to have sex with my date. Same, ask men that too. Men, if I engaged in this behavior, I'd want to have sex with my date. Ask both men and women if I engaged in it, I would want to have sex. So this is sexual intent. There is intent to have sex. Then also asked men and women, if my date engaged in this action, she would want to have sex with me. This is sexual perception. Because in the second one, they're perceiving that the person wants to have sex with them. In this first one, they're indicating that they want to have sex. And it was rated from extremely unlikely to extremely likely. So what was found here is these perceptions. They came out pretty interesting. And we'll look at these more on the next slide. But perceptual bases of sexual intent. So this was the likelihood, this first one is the likelihood of sexual interest. So the perception that the person wanted, their partner wanted to have sex with them when they did these things. Passionately kissed. Said I love you. Held hands and invited to the apartment for a drink. And again, these are perceptions where the person is saying it, what is the person interpreting. Now, in all cases, the men perceive sexual intent greater than women perceive it. So this isn't how likely they are to engage in the act. This is how they perceive it if this happened. And in all cases, even holding hands, men perceive it as a greater interest in sex than women do. So what Marty Hazelton came up with is what's referred to now as error management theory. And as I said, error management theory applies to many different things now. It's any time where you've got this two things that are in direct opposition and conflict, where increasing the chance of having one type of error decreases the chance of having the other type of error. So what we're going to have here is different types of errors. And these different types of errors are going to be on this. So in the female here, we've got sexual intent. So we're referring now to just the female having sexual intent and just the male inferring it. So this is sexual intent and sexual perception. Sexual intent and perception. So let's look at how this comes out. So I'll draw the box out in a minute, or I'll bring the box up in a minute. It all comes up as one. But when we've got here, actually we'll just bring them all up. So when we've got here, in this case here, we're looking at this box here. We've got the female intends sex. Her action she's performing, she is saying she intends sex. Here in this first box is where the male is interpreting or inferring that she intends sex. So this is a correct detection. This is where the guy got it right. We don't have to go any farther here. There's no big issue here. She wanted to have sex. He interpreted it as she wanted to have sex. Let's go down to the one down here. This is where she doesn't want to have sex. He interprets it that she doesn't want to have sex. This is a correct rejection. So in this case, there's no sex intended. He interprets it as no sex. The perception is correct. No further issues here. However, there's two times where there is issues, which means there's two types of errors. First is where she intends sex. So we'll go with the miss here. She intends sex. He doesn't think she's intending sex. This is what's referred to as a missed opportunity. Because she wanted to have sex, he didn't interpret as her wanting to have sex, so he missed a mating opportunity. On the other hand, there's where she doesn't want to have sex, but he is interpreting it that she wants to have sex. This here is referred to as a false alarm. He thinks she wants to have sex, but she doesn't. As long as we don't get into anything else, and like I said, we'll talk about sexual assault and things like that in future. We're not talking about that here. We're talking about just his interpretation. So these are two different types of errors. You have a miss and a false alarm. So which one do you think evolutionarily is a bigger error? We're not talking about morally. We're talking about evolutionarily. Which one is a bigger error? And I will tell you this is asymmetrical for evolution. One of the two of these is a much bigger error than the other when it comes to, again, evolutionarily. If you guessed the miss, you are correct. That is because, and I'll switch slides. That is because a missed mating opportunity is, in evolutionary terms, a missed opportunity to reproduce, which means genes aren't getting passed on. This is a lower cost error because there was never a mating opportunity in the first place. This is a high cost error because there was a missed mating opportunity. So when you're talking in reproductive terms, this is a very high cost error. Now, when we look at this then, it then should make sense that men should have an evolutionary pressure to favor making this kind of error rather than making this kind of error. If given the opportunity, men should make the error of false alarm more often than they make the error of missed sexual opportunity. What do I mean by that? I mean, these are in direct opposition, because this is men interpreting that the woman doesn't want to have sex. This is men interpreting that the woman does want to have sex. So they can't be doing both at the same time. They have to interpret that she doesn't want sex or interpret that she does want sex. So in order to reduce the chance of making the high cost error, men should more often interpret that women want to have sex. Therefore, they're increasing the chance of this type of error. By decreasing the higher cost error, they're increasing the chance of making the lower cost error. What do I mean here? I mean that this is why men interpret many things as sexual intent even when they're not. Let's look at a real-world example of that. Real-world example of the supermarket chain Safeway. The supermarket chain Safeway instructed their employees to smile, to make eye contact with customers, to call them by their names, all in terms of improving customer service. There's a big issue here. All of those things, smiling, making eye contact, with customers, calling them by their names, this can be interpreted as flirting. In general, women do not interpret this as flirting. Guys, on the other hand, interpret this as flirting, at least when women are doing it. So this policy worked really well, except when the employees were female and the customers were male. The males then frequently responded with sexual comments, sexual come-ons, even things like stalking, because the men, using this error management bias, men have evolutionarily adapted to over-perceiving sexual intent so they don't miss mating opportunities. Well, the result is that these things that weren't flirting were interpreted as flirting by men, were interpreted as sexual intent. In actuality, female employees sued the supermarket because of all the harassment they were getting. So it just shows the real-world example where this comes into play. And this is why men often misinterpret women's sexual intent. Men can work on this. It's not something that's a given. Ever since I found out about this, I really worked hard to tone down my perception of women's flirting. Things that like, let's say I have someone who comes up and starts talking to me, a woman who comes up and starts talking to me, and she's smiling and she's happy and all that. My mind automatically, and for most guys this is the case, the minds automatically are, oh, she's doing this because she's into me. She's doing this because she wants to have sex. No, that's not the case. And you got to shut it down. As a guy, you've got to shut it down. So I've found myself having to shut this perception down that no, she really isn't into me in that way. And it's really interesting phenomenon, and it's just one of those that men in evolutionary theory is great for this. It teaches these things, and that men who learn these things can learn to step back on this misperception and therefore potentially avoid conflict and avoid issues. Let's look at the other side of it, because error management theory doesn't just apply to men, it applies to women, but in different ways. What's going on here is female's counterpart is commitment skepticism. So a quote, he spent all day at the mall picking out the perfect necklace for her birthday and it cost $700, but she was unimpressed. What's going on here? What's going on here is the opposite. So in this case, when we talk about commitment, and let's look at it, men, women, That was really sloppy, but I think you know what I mean. And this is intends commitment, doesn't intend commitment. Sorry about my really sloppy writing, but intends commitment and doesn't intend. And perceives, women perceive, I cannot write today, but women perceive, that's hilarious. Women perceive intends commitment and doesn't intend commitment. So we've got 4 different things that can happen here. We've got a correct, perceives intended commitment and perceived it, and perceived didn't, and one doesn't intend commitment and perceived doesn't intend. However, if the man doesn't intend commitment and the woman perceives it, this is a false. And if the man intends commitment and the woman perceives that he doesn't, this is false. Which one of these is worse for women evolutionarily? It is this one. This one is worse because if a woman perceives that he intends commitment, gets into a long-term relationship, but he isn't intending commitment, then that is potential loss of time, resources, all of that. Whereas if he intends commitment and it's missed, then it's okay because maybe I'll catch it next time. But it's much worse to get into a relationship with someone who doesn't intend commitment. So let's look at a brief conclusion. Strategic interference in mating has been a pervasive feature during our evolutionary history. It has resulted in antagonistic, intersexual coevolution, which has produced many adaptations and counter-adaptations, include desires, preferences, behavioral strategies, cognitive biases, emotional defenses, morphology changes, and this along the lines of error management theory. Okay, let's now transition into jealousy. So jealousy, it's a major source of conflict for men and women engaged in long-term relationships because it comes from the possibility of infidelity. Jealousy arises from the suspicion of infidelity. Jealousy can occur even without infidelity occurring, but it arises due to the perception that infidelity could occur. There is actually a sex difference in jealousy. Men are expected to experience jealousy more intensely when the partner has sexual relations with another. So there's 2 types of infidelity that can occur. There's emotional infidelity and sexual infidelity. We've got sexual infidelity and emotional infidelity. Sexual infidelity is actually having sexual intercourse. Emotional infidelity is having feelings for, falling in love with, that type of thing. So men are expected to experience jealousy more intensely when their female partner has sex with another man rather than when they fall in love with another man, but doesn't have sex with them. Jealousy occurs in both instances, I should point out. They're expected to have jealousy in both, but of the 2, there should be higher for sex than emotional. That is really bad written. I'm just going to erase that entirety. It's higher for sex. Sexual infidelity for men. For women, it should be the opposite. Women are expected to become more jealous when their male partner becomes emotionally involved with another woman, rather than a man who has a one-time affair but doesn't become emotionally involved. So it's higher for emotional infidelity. Again, women will become jealous for both sexual and emotional infidelity, but when given a dichotomous situation, they should become more jealous for emotional. There is actually evidence for this. There is a lot of evidence. This is a cross-cultural. It's been found in many different cultures. I took out the slide where I examined these different cultures, but this has been found in all cultures studied. It's been found to be the opposite case in homosexual couples. So homosexual men find emotional worse, and homosexual women find sexual infidelity worse. Again, the jealousy occurs in both cases, but it's men get more jealous from sexual infidelity than emotional infidelity. Women get more jealous from emotional infidelity than sexual infidelity. And like I said, this is one of those findings of buses that's been questioned over and over again. And the actuality is that it's had study after study after study that has supported this conclusion. Let's look at tactics of mate retention. So what are tactics that people do to keep their partner from being unfaithful? So feelings of jealousy, they can't evolve unless they're adaptive behaviors of some kind. So preventing a partner from leaving the relationship or being unfaithful comes from this feeling of jealousy. So in a result, mate retention tactics. So for this, Buss and Shackelford asked undergrads to suggest possible mate retention tactics. What they found out is things like I pretend to be mad so they would feel guilty, or I bought them jewelry. There's a long list of mate retention tactics. We'll look at some of those here, and I'll talk about some of my research that's been done on this topic. Let's look at some of those. So perform more by men. Display of resources, concealing their mates from rivals, so things like holding hand and reading personal mail, derogating or use of violence to deter rivals, so derogating rivals, talking bad about rivals, or even violence towards rivals. And the last one is submitting or groveling to their partner, told their partner that they would die if she ever left them. Stuff like that. These are tasks, these are mate retention tasks that are performed more by men than women. Now let's look at the ones performed by women. So the ones performed more by women are enhancing appearance. So doing things to make themselves extra attractive. Provoking jealousy, pretending to be mad, talking to other men at a party, things like that. Demanding commitment. So this is a way to get that commitment. Or just like the previous one, but derogating rivals, so starting bad rumors. So that's one that women do often as well. So when it comes to these mate retention tactics, men and women do different things, but overall they've got the same goal. That is to reduce chances of infidelity. Let's look at some contextual factors influencing mate retention tactics. So things like when a wife has high reproductive value, a man's mate retention tactics should increase. And what has been found is men married to younger women report greater mate retention tactics. What you see over here is age of spouse and the correlation between mate retention tactics and the age of the spouse. And for men, it is much higher than it is for women. The correlation remains strong even after controlling for husband's age and relationship length. That's what comparison B was. So the wife's age highly predicted partner concealment tactics, verbal signals of possession, and possessive ornamentation. So the mate retention tactics that were used based on wife's age tended to be more in the domain of concealment as well as signals of possession. Again, we're not talking about ethics here. We're talking about the actual behaviors that people engage in. How about the other side of the coin? For women. So when a husband is wealthy and or high social status, wife's mate retention tactics should increase. And what has been found here is that correlations between men's social status and a wife's mate retention tactics. That's what you see up here. So this is male social status or partner social status and mate retention tactics. The correlation is higher for women than it is for men of these specific mate retention tactics: direct guarding, vigilance, emotional manipulation, and appearance enhancement. The correlations were far weaker for a status-striving wife, so for women who are higher status. Let's talk about my research for a minute. I did mate retention, mate guarding research. I do it on observable behaviors though. So I talked about this a little bit in my in the intro and syllabus, but what I had is couples came into a lab. They gave a saliva sample. They were put into a room they thought was a waiting room while they had to let their hormonal levels get down before they could have another saliva sample. They had to sit next to each other in that room. Then after 2.5 minutes, a attractive confederate or a high dominance confederate, attractive female or a high dominance male, rated independently, would come in and sit across from the person who was the opposite gender of themselves. So if the confederate was a female, she would come in and sit across from the guy. She would direct her attention towards the guy, ask him if he was there for the single study too, things like that, to try and not necessarily flirt, but show attention towards. And the couple was being recorded during this time, and I was interested to see if the couple sat closer together and touched more when the confederate was in the room. So in situations where potential same-sex rivals may have access to your partner, proximity and touching may be used as forms of mate guarding. So what does proximity do? Proximity deters potential rivals. Basically, if you're closer to your partner, rivals can't get to them. It also reduces the possible opportunities for infidelity. If you're closer to your partner, they can't commit infidelity. Touching, on the other hand, it tells the partner that you're being watched, also tells the potential rival that the partner has been taken. And interestingly enough, basically what I expected to find is both of these were highly used as mate guarding techniques, mate guarding strategies. When the confederate was in the room, the couple sat closer together and they touched more than when the confederate was not in the room. And I also had the couples go back and respond to Bus's mate retention inventory after they'd done this, and the items on the mate retention inventory that we were just talking about, some of those that men and women do, the items on it relating to proximity and touching correlated with the proximity and touching behaviors of the couples, showing that their self-report and their actual behaviors are pretty similar. Just some kind of things to clean up on short-term versus long-term. Some marriage arrangements that are out there, and we'll talk about these various throughout the semester. Monogamy is one man, one woman. Polygyny is one man, many women. Polyandry is one woman, many men. Typically, what you've got here is brothers. It's extremely rare, but in the cases that are found in hunter-gatherer societies, the men are typically going to be brothers, so they're already genetically related. Polygamy is becoming more common in industrialized societies. There's definitely cultures that already have it as part of their culture, but it's becoming more common where people can have multiple partners at the same time. So we will talk about that when we talk about love and affection. Another thing to hit on is, why do people leave a long-term relationship? Why disillusion of relationships? This can happen for various different reasons when it comes to an evolutionary sense. First, the current mate becomes less desirable. It could be due to a decrease in resources, failure to provide resources, loss of mate value, various different things relating to that. It could be new possibilities arise because of an increase in mate value. So this is like when people do things like lose weight, or men get a better job, stuff like this. So they increase their mate value, they increase and they could leave their partner for a higher mate value partner. Compelling alternatives could suddenly become available. So when we talk about things like commitment, and we'll talk about love and commitment later, we'll talk about the fact that commitment involves a few different components, and one of those components is quality of alternatives, quality of alternative partners out there. And if the quality of alternative partners goes up, then commitment goes down, and this could mean leaving the relationship. So the main reasons that have been found for divorce, first is infidelity, next is infertility, next is sexual withdrawal, lack of economic source, in polygamous cultures, conflict amongst co-wives, and then finally cruelty or lack of kindness. I just want to point out that these here are all strongly evolutionarily selected for. So conflict in relationships. Most conflict in relationships comes down to these four things right here. It's not always, but it could be money. A lot of people have issues with money, that lack of economic support. A lot of people have issues with sex, sexual withdrawal. People who want to have kids who have trouble having kids, that's that infertility. And then anytime sexual infidelity occurs and is caught, that has a very high likelihood of leading to divorce. So all of these main ones come from evolutionary reasons. So let's look at a few things real quick here at the end before we finish up Buss's book and move on to the other book. So Buss said, to preserve a marriage, couples should remain faithful, produce children together, have ample economic resources, be kind, generous, and understanding, never refuse or neglect a mate sexually. Obviously, that last one's a bit extreme, but the point remains that all of these are things that have an effect on relationships. So if any of these fails, the relationship can fail. And obviously, someone doesn't have to never refuse. But refusal and increased refusal can lead to relationship dissolution. Buss also said, to an extraordinary degree, predilections of the investing sex, females, potentially determine the direction in which the species will evolve, for it is the female who is the ultimate arbiter of whom she may and how often and with whom. And this is actually a quote from Sarah Hrdy, another evolutionary researcher and relationship researcher. And basically what it comes down to is, even in humans, so in most species, women do the choosing, men do the competing. Even in humans, where men do some choosing and women do some competing, it does come back to the woman who does the majority of the choosing. So females of the species are driving many of the evolutionary pressures that we have on us. So at the end here, we'll look at female mating strategies, just kind of to wrap all of this up. Female mating strategies are to display beauty, seek resources, seek commitment, seek health, seek parental investment, seek dominance and masculinity, at least for short-term partners, and seek resources in exchange for mating, at least in short-term partners. So for women, there's a lot of choosing going on. There is some competing going on, but there's a lot of choosing going on. Some competing, but a lot of choosing. Conversely, male mating strategies should be to seek signs of beauty. So this is where they are doing choosing. This is in direct opposition to the women displaying, not direct opposition, but directly compared to women displaying beauty, men seek it. Just like women seek resources, men display resources. Men display commitment, just like women seek commitment. When men display physical prowess, bravado, self-confidence, those things that indicate health, which women seek. Men can do a nice guy strategy where it's more of a parental investment type strategy, and which goes back to women seeking parental investment. Men can display dominance and masculinity, which women seek out for short-term mating, and men can trade resources for mating opportunities, which again is directly related to what women do look for in short-term mating, or can look for. So we've got this is choosing, all of these are competing. And then we do have a final one for men here, and that's male-male alliances. There's some relations to homosexuality here and how this has relations to evolutionary pressures. These are things we'll talk about later when we talk about homosexuality. Male-male alliances can also lead to being chosen more, because male-male alliances lead to things like more resources and things like that. Okay, that is all I have for these slides. These last two slides were kind of a wrap-up, so I didn't do a review slide. This lecture this week was pretty long. Most weeks are a little bit less than that. But that being said, thanks. Come on back.